Okay, welcome back everyone. It's good to see you all today. We're really excited about today's talk, and we're joined by Professor Matt Garcia from Dartmouth. And I'm going to introduce Professor Garcia in about a minute here. I just wanted to take a couple of minutes beforehand to do a couple of things, including framing the day and how it connects to tomorrow. So the first thing is the sign-in sheet. So as we said yesterday, the sign-in of the attendance is really important for us because this is a grant that we got, and we want to show that we're serving a big part of our community with this with the grant that we got. And so signing in is proof to our funders that that we had a big impact with this work. The second thing is to keep in mind that today is going to be more of a presentation lecture format. So if you're a student here and you want to take notes, or your teacher has asked you to take notes, then it would be a good time to either have some paper out or maybe open up another window on your tablet or computer so you can jot down some notes. Or just kind of sit back and relax and learn. I think that's often our preferred way of learning. However, I will say this, on Friday, we are going to have our final session, and there we're going to talk about ending our journey with a cookbook, with creating a cookbook that represents your family recipes and your culture. And one of the things that we're going to ask you to consider as we start to put some of those pieces together is what we've learned from our guest speakers, Professor Garcia, and then tomorrow's guest speaker, David Bacon. So you might want to jot down a quote that resonates with you, or two today, and the same for tomorrow. And then hold on to those quotes because we might return to them on Friday. That being said, this talk is really going to pick up where we left off yesterday. We're talking about avocado and citrus, and we started to talk about their journey sort of on a big scale. In terms of country and origin, we're really going to look at that journey as it relates to our borders, in particular the border between Mexico and the United States. And so this is really a good way to kind of continue this conversation, or the way that Tani framed it yesterday, this journey from farm labor to family table. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our guest speaker today. And our guest speaker is Professor Matt Garcia. And Matt Garcia is obsessed with two things. He's obsessed with where food comes from and how the people involved in its production were treated. The fascination with this topic comes from his family experience in food production. And that spans 3 generations in working in California. On his mother's side, his grandfather earned his living working as a white-collar data analyst for Sunkist, which, as we know, it's the big citrus company. And then on his father's side, his Mexican grandparents, the Garcia side, were field workers and picked fruit that Sunkist sold. So an interesting connection there between the family sides. Matt is also fascinated by the movements of hope that grow out of inequality, exploitation, and moments of conflict in rural California. At root, his work seeks to understand who we are as a society by knowing how we feed ourselves. Matt received his PhD from the Claremont Graduate School in 1997. Since then, he has taught at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, the University of Oregon, Brown University, and he served as the director of the School of Historical, Philosophical, and Religious Studies at Arizona State University. Currently, he is the professor of Latin American, Latino and Caribbean Studies and History at Dartmouth College. And also, before he takes it from here, his research in a book that he wrote, A World of Its Own, inspired a lesson that we created looking at the development of East Side rock and roll music, or as we call in the Chicano community, oldies. And we created a lesson for teachers to teach their students about how this music was formed and how it actually represents some resistance on the part of youth living in East LA and the San Gabriel Valley. So we're going to drop the link in the chat for you all to access. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to Matt. Let's give him a round of applause by either clapping or doing the clap emoji. Thank you, Matt.
Thank you. Thank you. It's nice to be back in Southern California. I want to thank Danny and Tani. They've been such gracious hosts. I want to thank UCLA and Plaza I also want to acknowledge the Abenaki people whose land I am speaking from right now in New England. And I think it's always important to do a land acknowledgement. So thank you to the Abenaki for allowing me to have a place at Dartmouth and to do this work. So many years ago, I published that book that Danny talked about, and then I eventually published a book about the United Farm Workers. But in the process of doing this work, I met lots of really important people that were doing food studies, including Melanie Dupuy and Don Mitchell, who were kind of co-travelers that were exploring the same questions. And we were essentially asking a question that's been asked many times before, and that is, are you what you eat, right? And really the answer to that question is yes, but it needs to be, I think, interrogated a bit, because what we eat today depends on foods that cross borders or people that cross borders to produce that food, right? And so that was a question that we didn't have an easy answer to, because we were uncomfortable with what we were finding in terms of how farm workers were treated, particularly in Mexico. And then we know historically the ways in which farm workers are treated in the United States. So it led to this really important project that has actually taken on a life of its own and is taught across the country now, called Food Across Borders, where we ask the question, you know, what are the consequences of answering that answer? We are what we eat, if that food comes from people that cross the border or foods that cross that border. And I want to just introduce to you, let's see, it's not advancing. There we go. The kind of undergirding political theory beneath this, which comes from all the way back from the 17th century, and Thomas Hobbes, who published a book called Leviathan. And he's reflecting on the notion of the body politic, the ways in which the governed assign legitimacy and authenticity to those that govern them. At that point in time, he's talking about a monarchy, but he's acknowledging that the king doesn't rule by divine right, but it's a social contract between the individuals and that sovereign. So you see in this picture, you actually see it made the king made up of individuals, and it's a kind of visual manifestation of the contract. So one of the things that a government does, whether it's a monarchy or it's a democracy like ourselves, its essential function, one of its essential functions, is to provide access to sustenance or food. So a government or a society that can't feed itself doesn't live long, doesn't succeed. And this gave rise to the notions of cuisine, particularly in the 17th, 18th century. And essentially, these are the things that make people a people. So if you think about it, there's French cuisine, right, that is known as sophisticated, and they often have these markers that go with them that are hierarchical, somewhat problematic, can be discriminatory even. So Mexican food is often seen as earthy, or Thai food exotic, or soul food associated with Black people, Southern Black people, as comfort food, right? So as I said, in the worst cases, we won't go into that, it can be discriminatory, but in the best case, for the people that eat that food, right, depend on that food, identify with that food, it makes them feel connected to their culture, and at times connected to a place, especially when those people are mobile, such as African Americans that moved to the north that ate soul food in places like Detroit and Chicago. But that's absolutely true for Latinos that leave their homes in Central America or Mexico and come here and reconstitute a cuisine that makes them feel whole and gives them a kind of connectedness to the places they come from. So that's my story, basically. I mean, Danny laid it out there, but I want to lay it out a little bit more clearly. I come from people that cross borders, and in fact, my legacy, if you will, this is in the title of the entire program, the legacy of how food connects us. Well, food connects me to you, me to Los Angeles, me to the place of my origins. And and through that connection, I'm connected to Mexico, which is where Daniel Martinez, who's there in the middle, started. He migrated from Michoacan in the beginning of the 20th century. He came and settled in downtown LA and started a carniceria, which is a meat market. And he had to close that shop in the Depression. And because of that, his daughter, his eldest, the matriarch of my family, Cheva Garcia, there's a young Cheva picking crops, and then an older Cheva with my father and me, who went on the migrant trail, as so many Mexican people did in the 1930s, and picked fruit, and was very much active in that world. My father ended up following in his great-grandfather's steps and owning a carniceria in Azusa. And that's where I learned how to cut meat and to be someone that produced food. And now today, I'm running a sustainable regenerative agricultural farm in Vermont, where I raise beef and chickens and cows. And I feel very connected to my family. And in fact, my grandmother, who's 96 today, still calls me and talks to me about butchery and talks to me about the cows and talks to me about the recipes. And I make, albondigas, and I make all these things that my grandmother sort of made for me when I was a young man growing up and getting educated in Southern California. And so I feel very connected by food production, and the farm work that kind of makes our family. And it's my legacy. And I think it's an illustration of the things that bind a people. They can bind a people in terms of cuisine, but they can bind a family and bind a community. So when I was working with my father in the 1990s, I was traveling to the LA wholesale market with him. And we encountered just an amazing abundance of tropical fruits and foods that changed seemingly every year in the 80s and 90s as we went to this wholesale market in downtown LA from Azusa. We'd get in the van around 3:30, we'd hit there, and we would buy all of these fruits and vegetables. And increasingly what we saw is fruits and vegetables that had not been there the year before. And that was in reflection of the kind of immigration that was happening in LA and the LA suburbs during that time. So it's important to note, yes, avocados really became a thing at this time. We've now become accustomed to it being a necessary ingredient for guacamole during Super Bowl Sundays. And it was this period in which it's really booming, and it's because of this connection and because of this community. But the interesting thing was mangoes. Mangoes had not been really a kind of daily consumption product or produce until many Latinos started moving to Southern California and to the United States. Only 1/3 of Euro-Americans had ever purchased the fruit in the 1990s when I was going with my father. So that meant that half of all mangoes that were exported from Mexico were consumed in Los Angeles by predominantly immigrants. And this kind of tells the story of how a nation's and a community's cuisine changes because of immigration, and it actually is made more interesting, more tasteful, and more connected in many ways to the places of the current inhabitants' origins. So this place kind of educated me and excited me to study this topic. And so mangoes, of course, are critical to Latino food, but it is also a very important contributor to the other big fad that's growing in the late 2000s, or early 2000s, late 20th century, which is Thai food. And so in that book, Food Across Borders, we explore the ways in which Asian food, and Thai in particular, comes to define a people and a place and a cuisine in Southern California. And so the profile, the flavor profile is known as yum, which is a salty, sour, sweet, creamy, and spicy combination. And it depends on all of those ingredients that are coming from across the border. Initially, it would come in through Asian markets, such as this one here in North Hollywood, which is Bangkok Market. But before Bangkok Market, it was mostly Chinese markets that had existed for a very long time, had connections to the products in Asia. With the owner of the Bangkok Market, who started in Hollywood in 1971, which is the center of the Thai community, this was Pramorte Tilamonko. Tilamonko was someone who said, I don't like paying all of these exorbitant communication or transportation costs to bring in these exotic ingredients that are necessary to have this yum profile, this tasty profile. And so he started to, there's Bangkok Market. He started to turn to the gifts of free trade. Now, we think of free trade, and I'm going to get into it, as a kind of negative. It undermined local economies. It displaced many of the immigrants that came to Southern California and eventually throughout the United States. And I'll get to that story in the second half. But one of the things that I think we need to reckon with is that free trade also has a kind of Janus face. And I want to start with the kind of positive ways in which entrepreneurs like Tilamunkel or even my father were able to exercise a kind of free market logic under free trade that was essentially managing a situation that was handed to them, not one of their own making, but they made, as they say, lemonade out of lemons, right? So what's amazing about Tilamunkel is that in order to find those ingredients at a much more affordable cost for their working class customers, they could no longer keep trying to get them from Asia, but they started to search for them locally. What's interesting is the kaffir leaf, which is a citrus leaf, very important in Thai food. They initially went out to Riverside, California, where there's a citrus station, and they would sneak into the citrus station and essentially steal these kaffir leaves. But eventually, they knew they needed something more reliable, and it was actually under free trade and NAFTA that they were able to set up a network of farms in Sinaloa and Nayarit and also parts of Baja California that were able to grow the very specific ingredients that Thai people and Asian immigrants more generally really came to depend on. And I would just talk about, I mean, in terms of a Bangkok market, I would say there were many different markets like this. My father's market was like this in many ways, where we started getting fruits and vegetables. We got dragon fruit from the LA market that became available largely because the immigration that was coming to Southern California redefined what it meant to be an Angelino in that time, right? And so ultimately, what was key to our success, to Tilamunkel's success, was the ability to access food grown by people on the other side of the border, right? So in many ways, free trade has this effect of creating the opportunity or the accessibility of food that makes a community whole, right? And I think that that is something that's often left out of stories of NAFTA and free trade. Now, there's the other side of it, right? And I want to turn and allow you to think about the foods that make you whole or give you what you need to be you. In other words, what foods do I need to make me me? For me, moving to Vermont and Dartmouth, I was very far away from the foods that make me whole. And so I ultimately started growing my own meat or raising my own meat, in part to have things like oxtail or to cook a pig's head or do all of these things that my grandmother brought me up to do and to affirm my identity, right? And in many ways, I am very privileged to be able to do that because I have scaled the mountain of academic hierarchies. I'm at Dartmouth. I'm well paid. I'm able to have time to farm, and I've tried to turn that into a kind of practice that I want people to see as a model for feeding oneself. I'm engaged in regenerative agriculture. I do grazing that actually reduces the amount of CO2 in the air as opposed to contributing to ozone depletion, right? But I recognize that that is a privilege, and it is something that not everybody can do, right? So in most cases, right, and this is part of the kind of valorization of local foods and what we were in some ways challenging with food across borders. Because at the time of food across borders, there was, and still to some extent is, a celebration of eating local, which I very much agree with. But eating local means you're eating very expensive food, right? So most people depend on the food that comes by way of that LA wholesale market. And there's wholesale markets all over the United States. It's not just in Los Angeles. And that food is often produced through conventional agriculture, not the kind of regenerative agriculture that I'm practicing or that is celebrated in farmers markets today. And for the most part, working class people, immigrant people, mobile people get their identity by eating foods that pass through other hands and often pass across a border, right? So I think the question that we started with that book still remains and is actually even more true today. And I want to challenge you to think about it as well. How do I make sure that my identity, if your identity is wrapped in what you eat, how does my identity, do I make sure that my identity doesn't come at the expense of someone's dignity, right? In the era of free trade, in the era of NAFTA, which I'll explore in the second half, there were conditions close to slavery found in the United States, right? That was providing some of those necessary food items. In Mexico, there was actual slavery, and I think David Bacon, who will speak tomorrow, will actually highlight this, right? So as a conscientious consumer, we need to grapple with that issue. And our food practices, while they define us as a culture and as a people and as an individual, sometimes come at the expense of the dignity of workers in that world. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to leave that as a breakout question. And then I'm going to explore the darker side of NAFTA and to explore some organizations that are helping to answer that question, both for me locally and I think more generally nationally as well, which I hope leaves you with a sense of what can you do and what can we do to make sure that we don't sacrifice workers' dignity to have the foods we need. So I'll let you, Danny, take over and do the breakout.
Thanks, Matt. Okay, so as you heard, we're going to have a breakout room session. We're going to keep them small so it has a chance for you all to kind of get to know each other and chat. So just like yesterday, quick introductions. And then there's two questions, right? And so the first one is what Matt was talking about. What is that food or foods that make you you, right? Like you couldn't live without these. It would have a sort of like psychological impact on you. And then the other question is a big one, right? And it's one that we're really going to grapple with the second part of this talk and throughout the week. And so if you're not sure how to approach that second question, one thing to consider is, well, what do I need to start asking myself about the food that I eat? What questions do I need to ask in order to start to think about the dignity of those who are producing the food and picking the food? What questions should I be asking about these meals that I'm eating? So that's one way to approach the question that you might find helpful. So I'm thinking about 5 minutes. Matt, does that sound about right?
Yeah, that sounds good. Yeah.
So we'll have 5 minutes for breakout to have these very quick discussions. Then we'll rejoin and we'll hear the second part of this talk. Might you have any questions about what we're going to be doing? I'm using my teacher pause. All right, so we're gonna go ahead and jump into those breakout rooms. You'll see a prompt show up, and from there you'll be taken to your room.
Hi, everyone.
Hi. How do you pronounce your name? Is it Akin?
It's a Chin Mensa. Like,
Akin Mensa. Nice to meet you.
nice to meet you too.
Yeah. Do you wanna start us off about what kind of food makes you you?
I guess so. Like, I enjoy eating like plantains, like fried, baked. It doesn't really matter. Like stews, soups. Like, there's this thing native to my culture. It's called jollof rice. It's like a special way they make the rice. It's
Oh,
kind of like orange rice in the Mexican culture, but like it it tastes different, but it looks similar.
what's the culture that you identify with?
I'm Ghanaian American.
Oh, cool. Yeah. I think for me, the foods that make me me well, so I moved abroad for many years. I moved to Scotland where the food is really different, and for me the foods that made me me were like things that reminded me of the States, of home. So, and it was like funny things that I never ate much here growing up, like American candy and stuff like that. So I think, and now that I'm back here, I don't really eat that stuff anymore. So I feel like what makes me me changes depending on where I am.
Yeah, I could resonate with that.
Yeah. Ella or Romero or Henry, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I could jump in.
Cool.
Oh yeah, my name is Henry, and I guess the food, I have a very Americanized dish because I've lived here my entire life. Um, oh yeah, because my favorite dishes that everybody knows are like pizza and burgers and like that basic American food. But yeah, I culturally I do identify more like as Mexican American for that reason, because like my friends did come from Mexico, but the only like the closest connection I've had to like the place over there is the food that they brought with them. So like some foods that they like enjoy eating are like tortas and their beans and their rice. My dad actually taught me a way of like how he ate like like not rice, beans and eggs as like a sandwich. There's like this specific way, and just stuff like that. There's also like tamales, um what's it called, pozole. I love that.
Me too.
Yeah, especially on like during around Christmas. Yeah, that's when they start making like all the warm foods like tamales and pozole, and then yeah, that's about it.
Cool. What do you guys think about that dignity question? Like, what are the things that we can think about when we choose our food to make sure that we're not um, taking away someone else's dignity?
I was kind of confused on like the way they worded the question because like depending on the context, how can you like maintain someone's dignity when it comes to food?
I think they're thinking about the conditions that workers involved in producing that food are in.
If we're talking about from that sense, I guess like just not taking that for granted. I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, maybe it's really hard, isn't it? Because you never really know when you go to the grocery store where something's come from and like who's been involved in producing it.
Mm-hmm. I guess as long as like we can recognize where they come from, like whether these farms, these people are working hard, and not just like say like, oh, why isn't this in season? Why can't I get this food when there's some maybe something in the background going on that's causing that.
Yeah. Or maybe like one way to, I mean, it's more expensive, but if you can afford it and when you can afford it, you know, choosing organic is good, not just because there's pesticides on the food that we eat, but because for the people who work in the fields, they're being exposed to that kind of stuff, you know?
Yeah.
So yeah, that's one way to help ensure. Oh, we have to leave our breakout room now.
Great.
Okay, we'll begin. I think people are still trickling in from the breakout rooms. Mark,
Yeah.
are all the breakout rooms closed?
Yeah, Daniel.
Okay, thank you. Okay, folks, so we're going to go ahead and pick up where we left off. And so I'm going to hand it back to Professor Garcia. And if you have some questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. And we're going to have some time at the end to also address some of the questions that you might have. Okay, so with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it back to you, Matt.
Great. So I'm going to share my screen again. There we go. There we go. So it was interesting. I really enjoyed the breakout. We were just talking about menudo. In fact, there was conversation about how Asian people also eat the lining of a cow's stomach the way Mexican people do. And so that is sort of the magic of Southern California, in which you can get what you need maybe at a Chinese market as opposed to a Mexican market. And if you're closer to a Mexican market, then there's often that opportunity to get what you need, right? And so what I'm posing here is that these are the sort of unintended gifts or consequences of free trade. In fact, with regards to meat, just briefly, I'll share with you that there is a kind of flow of what we call offal, which is the innards of the cow, back to Mexico, and then the flow of like the cuts that are familiar to Euro-Americans, such as a ribeye, coming north to the United States. And that is a consequence of the reduction of tariffs and trade, cost of doing trade across the border. Again, unintended consequences, I think, of NAFTA that really are able to serve different markets and mobile communities on either side of the border. But of course, it raises a question, as I'm saying, what was intended, right, by NAFTA? And let me go forward here. Okay. Well, what was intended was to replace the kind of system that my grandmother participated in, where she was migrating throughout Central California, picking figs, picking cotton, picking citrus, picking anything that was grown. Because there was a notion that, in fact, that land was maybe too valuable to use it that way. There was also a notion that the labor was too expensive and that the production needs to go where the laborers are. And in fact, there's some truth to that, is that Mexican people in particular are agricultural people. They are people that know what to do with a cow, for example. So for example, where I'm living right now, we are a very heavy dairy state, and I'll get to that at the end of the talk, but Vermont is a very heavy dairy state. And in fact, many of the workers that make the dairy industry go in Vermont are migrants from Mexico and Guatemala because they have a familiarity with livestock agriculture, right? So the logic in some ways of NAFTA was to try to move the agriculture where the expertise is. And I think what that requires us to do is to always keep our minds and our attention on how food is produced, who's doing the labor to make that food available. And that's just a kind of modest point that I've made throughout my studies of food and food history. It used to be that there was always a kind of celebration of food history through the experience and the eyes of the chef, who is almost always Euro-American, and the people that worked in the kitchen were almost always unsung and were Latino or Asian. And that I think changes when we start to look at the ways in which meals and food is produced in our society. That if we don't segregate out the agriculture, we don't segregate out the kitchens and the sous chefs, we begin to see the different people that make the food available and to create the flavors that we think is essential to us as a people. But in the case of our modern day system, we live with a consequence of NAFTA as well. The ways in which people are displaced by these regimes, which are often referred to as neoliberalism. There's a market logic behind the reduction of trade barriers, and that is in terms of what they're trying to achieve, what is the stated intent of free trade. That is to bring production to the place where we think expertise is, and to some extent equalize or distribute wealth production on either side of the border. The problem with NAFTA was that it was heavily influenced by US corporations and well-placed farm lobby that was always interested in lowering the cost of labor. So while the stated purpose was to increase production where the workers are and to elevate the Mexican economy, the reality was that it was displacing the Mexican worker and forcing them to go north or even to migrate within Mexico. So we actually have people that are migrating from farms in Yucatan or Oaxaca to Baja California, where they become slaves and they start working and creating, harvesting strawberries that are consumed in California, right? Because there is no regulation now in those situations. Eventually, what happens is that these workers who might leave the Yucatan or Oaxaca to Baja California ultimately realize that even if the conditions are not ideal, the pay is much better still north of the border. So the kinds of migrations that we see are a consequence of little regulation of the kind of farms that are going on in Mexico, but also the other consequence, which is the undermining of the Mexican economy and the farms that many Mexican farmers made their living from, right? So one of the ways in which Mexican people are known is that they're known as the corn people. You think about tamales, you think about tortillas, you think about atol, and you think about the things that are really elemental to being Mexican. And one of the things that free trade did was to create a market for subsidized corn that is being produced in the United States. The farm lobby was one that was always looking for a place to sell its product. And in fact, by the year 2003, where this article comes from, Washington Post, Mexico was now importing more than a quarter of the corn it consumed from the United States. And that represented nearly a four-fold surge in since NAFTA took effect 9 years before. speaking to the Mexican worker who was once a farmer who farmed corn, but now had to go on the migrant trail and cross the border. He ended up reporting to the Washington Post. He said, what is my dream for the future? I want corn prices to be high again so I can go back to Mexico to farm, but I don't know if that will happen. So what ends up happening because of NAFTA is the undermining of the very existence that Mexican people were most capable of making a living at, which was farming. Where is their best opportunity to make a living with that knowledge? Sometimes it's in California, sometimes it's in the dairies of Vermont, for example, right? And they're forced to migrate. So instead of equalizing wealth and distributing jobs and investments where they need to be, it actually undermined the ability for Mexican people to stay where they are and to do the things that make them who they are and to feed themselves the way they see themselves needing to be fed. And the response that the United States had to this migration was to crack down on it, right? The reaction was that this is a problem. It's not a problem that we created, and we want to stop or discourage this migration by passing increasingly punitive legislation. So at the same time that this was happening, the Clinton administration, which is a Democratic administration, Bill Clinton, and his Attorney General, Janet Reno, passed Operation Gatekeeper to try to slow this migration that was created by NAFTA. And if you know anything about migration in the early 2000s, you know that the deaths in the desert really spiked. And that was where I was through this period when I was teaching at Arizona State, where we were watching increasing number of people crossing through the deserts because they had to, because they could not live with dignity. They could not engage in the food systems in Mexico that were created by NAFTA. And they had to go north to places where their knowledge and their skills still had purchase and still could get a much better wage. And the United States response was to force them further into the desert by militarizing the border zones or the passages such as in Tijuana or Nogales or El Paso, right? And so that's the period in which we see massive deaths happening in this period. And it's very much tethered to the undermining of the food systems in Mexico that I just showed you. So I want to end by just sharing with you how these kinds of situations actually reverberate throughout the entire United States. And they're accelerated by an event that had nothing to do with Mexico or with Latin America, and that was 9/11, right? So on 9/11, the attacks on New York City, there was the response of a brand new Homeland Security that was created, and the institution of a monitoring zone that spanned first 25 miles from the border of the United States, and then further in 100 miles into the United States, and it went around the entire country, right? This was a period of time also in which customs and it's a Customs and Border Protection CBP is traveling these areas, and you're getting increased checkpoints that are forcing many of the migrants that are coming to do food work into shadows and into deserts and creating the kind of death that I've just explained. For us in Vermont, where I sit right now, we exist within that 100-mile zone. And so, and that zone is near Quebec, the Canadian border, right? But in spite of the fact that we're far away from what we see as the border that needs to be regulated, the border that is infamous for people dying in the desert, the border that is infamous for harassment of immigrants, that same harassment happens for Latinos that are working in the dairy industry in Vermont that I just described, right? Because we have the border patrol traveling throughout our neighborhoods and capturing dairy workers that are simply trying to contribute to the economy and contributing to the food that makes Vermont special. So think about Ben and Jerry's, for example, which is proudly one of Vermont's biggest foods or industries that defines the state and defines New England. Well, it's dependent on mostly undocumented Latino workers who are put in harm's way by the kind of surveillance that has come first by NAFTA and then by September 11th. So what's happening today? Well, many of you probably would say, well, where is the United Farm Workers and Cesar Chavez's organization and Dolores Huerta's organization that was supposed to make things better for farm workers in the 1960s and 70s? Yes, to some extent they succeeded, and I've written a book about that, but their biggest problem was they were mostly anti-immigrant. They were absolutely for supporting resident citizen farm workers and building a union in which only people that have that privilege can actually participate in the union. Eventually, Cesar Chavez really backs away from that position, but the legacy of that position made many of these new migrants that came in doing this work during NAFTA and continuing to today very suspicious of that organization. And what it necessitated was new farm worker organizations to rise up and to kind of redefine what farm worker activism is today. So a good example or three here, I talk about PCUN, called Pineros y Campesinos Unidos Noroeste, which is an organization in Oregon. There's the Coalition of Immokalee Workers in Florida, and then there's Migrant Justice here in Vermont. And I think the main thing that these organizations do that are different from UFW is that they embrace the belief that workers have dignity and have worth regardless of their undocumented status. What we need to see is they are defining America, and they are defining the industries that make places like Vermont a destination for ice cream, for example, by migrants' labor, by the work that migrants do, regardless of their documented status. And so one of the things that these organizations all have in common is they embrace undocumented workers, and they start with the issue of how do we make these people feel comfortable and safe in their work environments. They don't ask questions about undocumented or documented, right? And in many ways, the first thing they do is they address the issues of how they get their papers in order, or how they navigate a Byzantine immigration system here, how they defend themselves when they end up in CBP's hands. So all of these things are things that these organizations are doing. I would not call them unions per se, and they don't call themselves unions. What they do see themselves as immigrants' rights organizations first. And I think that's really the key issue if we're going to have justice in our food system and in our farm labor system today. So let me end with this challenge and this question. And that is, how do we embrace the enhancements of our food culture, our cuisine, without contributing to the suffering of those that make our food possible, right? And what can we do to increase the positives in this food system and eliminate the negatives? So we're not going to change the fact that we are dependent, we are wed to that pozole or that menudo. We're not going to change the fact that Angelino culture is food culture is a place that embraces yum and embraces mangoes and embraces dragon fruit as essential ingredients to who we are as a multicultural society today. But how do we do that without harming the people whose hands that food passes through to make it to our markets and to make it to our plates? And so I leave you with that challenge. I think for me, it's supporting those organizations that I talked about, but I'll stop there and then take some questions or some comments.
All right, thank you, Dr. Garcia. Folks, this is a really good chance to ask some questions. We have a couple of minutes here. So if you have any questions, Marjorie, go ahead. You can unmute yourself and ask.
Am I unmuted? I can't tell. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, and I just lost the picture. But I am I was sharing at 15. I was part of a group called Kennedy Action Corps after Robert Kennedy died, and we did support. I'm from Northern California, and we started supporting Cesar Chavez, and I'm talking at 15, and we worked in the boycott. But what I'm saying is, there a way to wed the rights that a union can bring and the rights of the human rights of these organizations you're talking about? That's my question. Mm-hmm. Is there a way to bring them together to do maximum good?
Yes. So these organizations have taken the good from UFW and left out the bad. So one of the goods that they've taken from the UFW is consumer activism. So UFW was extraordinary in engineering the boycott to bring justice to grape workers, as you probably know, right? Yeah. And one of the ways in which, for example, Coalition of Immokalee Workers has brought justice to tomato workers in Florida is through a boycott of fast food restaurants like Taco Bell or Wendy's to get 1 penny per every tomato that's used in their food. And what do they do with that penny after they accumulate it, right? And it ends up being thousands of dollars, if not millions of dollars. They've built an organization that monitors work conditions in fields in Florida, so that we don't have the kind of slavery that you found at the beginning of NAFTA that I was talking about briefly, and you'll probably hear more about or see from David Bacon tomorrow, right? So Coalition of Immokalee Workers, they call it the Fair Food Program, and they set the agenda, and Migrant Justice in Vermont has followed suit by creating a similar program by taking pennies coming from the sale of Ben & Jerry's ice cream. And Ben & Jerry's has agreed to, has embraced the monitoring of their production sites for humane treatment of workers, right? So I think that's where I always encourage people to look to do justice, is to support these new organizations, to know about them, because we are still in many ways in a fog about the UFW and what was achieved by Cesar Chavez. The fact is that the problems and the ills that existed in his day did not get resolved and actually got worse with NAFTA.
Does anybody else want to ask a question? We might have time for one more. Okay, well, thank you. Again, you could unmute and clap, or you could just put the clap emoji. But let's all thank Matt for joining us today. Keep in mind, it's about to be 7 o'clock where he is. That's why it's a little darker in his space than ours, right? So Matt's joining us from the East Coast, from Vermont. So we're just thrilled that he was able to join us and do this talk and help us think about the politics of our food and the sort of human impact that the food that we eat has on labor and members of our community. We're going to continue this discussion tomorrow, and we're going to be joined by a labor activist and photographer named David Bacon. David's going to do a talk, but he's also going to frame his talk with some amazing photos that he took. So you're going to get a chance to analyze his photos, think about the photos, ask some questions, and he's going to talk to you about his experiences and his perspective on this topic. All right, we're going to put the evaluation right now in the chat. We really appreciate your feedback. Thank you so much for the feedback yesterday. It really helps us think about how we can make these, how we can continue to do the good and improve upon the things that you think we should be improving upon. So your feedback is really valuable there. So with that, I think we're going to sign off. If you have any questions that you want to ask us as we wrap up, feel free to stick around. And, you know, myself and Tani will be here for a few minutes if you have any questions that you'd like to ask.